He built an empire on rules, rules that kept him sharp, efficient, untouchable, no lateness, no small talk, no distractions, and one rule above all, no curvy women in his executive circle. To Ethan Ward, control was safety, perfection was power, and feelings. They were weaknesses best left outside the glass walls of his office. But life, as it often does, had other plans. The day Claire Monroe walked in, everything he thought he knew about discipline, desire, and dignity began to shift. She didn't break his rules with rebellion. She unraveled them with grace, with kindness, with the quiet strength of a woman who refused to shrink to fit someone else's definition of worth. This isn't just a story about love. It's a story about unlearning about a man who built walls so high. He forgot what sunlight felt like until someone brave enough stepped in and opened a window. Stay with this story, because sometimes the most powerful transformations don't come from winning, but from finally letting go. The morning light spilled through the glass walls of the 32nd floor, painting long gold stripes across Ethan Ward's office. From here, the city stretched endlessly towers of steel, glimmering like a kingdom built on silence. Ethan liked that silence. He had built his entire empire upon it. The office reflected his mind, minimal, precise, and almost too clean. Everything had its place. The chrome desk stood bare except for a laptop, a leather-bound notebook, and a single black pen, lined perfectly parallel to the desk's edge. Even the air seemed disciplined, chilled, filtered, untouched by warmth. At 6 o'clock every morning, Ethan began his ritual, a 5-mile run along the waterfront, the rhythm of his feet echoing against concrete. Then a black coffee, no sugar, no cream, brewed at exactly 185 degrees. No breakfast, no conversation. By 7, he was already scanning reports, mind sharp as glass, heart locked away where nothing soft could reach it. His staff often whispered that Mr. Ward ran his company like a machine. They weren't wrong, no lateness, no chatter in hallways, no personal questions, no bright colors in the office. And though it was never written anywhere, no curvy women in executive spaces, it wasn't a policy on paper, but everyone knew. It was one of his unspoken rules, a relic inherited from a mother who once told him, "Presentation is power. Never let softness weaken the image." Ethan had absorbed those words like commandments carved in stone, and over the years, they hardened into his skin. He believed in control not just of his company, but of every breath, every glance, every emotion that dared to rise. Control meant safety, and safety was the only form of love he ever learned to trust. The view outside his window changed with the season's spring blossoms, autumn fog, winter's blue light, but inside, everything remained the same chair, same pen, same silence. He didn't notice the way the world had begun to pass him by. The laughter that used to echo from the lobby, the colors people once wore before the office learned to blend into shades of gray. He had created a kingdom, one without chaos, without vulnerability, without the unpredictable pulse of life. And in doing so, he had exiled himself from it, sometimes late at night. When the city dimmed and even the hum of elevators grew still, Ethan would look at his reflection in the dark glass. A tall man in a tailored suit, sharp, polished, untouchable. Yet behind the clean lines and cold eyes, he saw something flicker, a shadow of the boy who once reached for softness and was told no. He would look away quickly, convincing himself that shadow didn't exist. That morning, the silence felt heavier than usual. Perhaps it was the rain clouds gathering beyond the skyline, or maybe it was the quiet ache that had begun to live somewhere beneath his ribs. He wouldn't have called it loneliness, he didn't believe in that word. But even in his world of symmetry and order, a faint restlessness had started to hum beneath the surface. He tried to drown it in precision, email, calendar, contracts, everything in its place, everything under control. At 9:58, the phone on his desk buzzed softly. Janet, his longtime assistant. The only person who'd stayed through his rise appeared in the doorway. Her presence was efficient, loyal, and mercifully quiet. "Your tenna, M, is here," she said. Ethan didn't look up immediately. He was reviewing a quarterly report, pen-tapping once, twice, in perfect rhythm. Who, he asked without inflection. Janet hesitated for just a moment, a pause so small most wouldn't notice. But in that pause was something different, something curious. "Claire Monroe," she said. The name hung in the air, unfamiliar yet strangely resonant. Ethan nodded once, briskly, closing the file with mechanical precision. "Send her in." Janet gave a small nod, but before she turned away, her gaze lingered on him as if she knew, somehow, that something in this silent kingdom was about to shift. When the door clicked shut behind her, Ethan exhaled slowly. He didn't know why his pulse had quickened, or why the hum of the city suddenly felt louder, closer. He straightened his tie, squared his shoulders, and waited. He had no idea that within minutes, the air inside his perfect office would change forever, that someone was about to walk in and rearrange the gravity of his world. But, for now, the king of the cold kingdom sat alone behind his glass wall, unaware that the first crack in his armor was already forming. And outside the door, a woman named Claire Monroe stood waiting, with a quiet confidence that would melt the ice of his carefully built life one heartbeat at a time. The door opened with a soft click, almost too gentle to disturb the quiet rhythm of Ethan Ward's morning. Yet, somehow, it did. The air shifted, as though the room had exhaled for the first time in years. She stepped inside, and the world seemed to bend not loudly, not dramatically, but in that subtle, almost invisible way that real change often begins. Claire Monroe. Her name had sounded simple when Janet spoke it, but now, standing in front of him, simplicity no longer seemed like the right word. She wore a soft gray dress, modest, tailored, yet somehow alive with warmth. Her caramel-colored hair was swept into a loose twist, a few strands falling naturally around her face. She carried no perfume that he could detect, yet there was something a quiet freshness, like the moment after rain. And her eyes, they were calm, not timid, not eager to impress, just calm, as if she had already made peace with the world long before walking into his. For a brief second, Ethan forgot the next line of his own script. He cleared his throat, motioning her toward the chair opposite his desk. "Miss Monroe, is it—" She smiled the kind of smile that didn't rush, that didn't need permission. "Yes. Thank you for seeing me, Mr. Ward." Her voice was even, low, pleasant, no nervous tremor, no false charm. She spoke as someone who had met men like him before and had chosen not to be intimidated by them. Ethan gestured for her to sit. He noticed against his will how her presence filled the minimalist room with something he hadn't allowed in years, softness that didn't apologize for being soft. The interview began in the usual order. Qualifications, previous employment, references. Her answers came without hesitation, each one measured and confident, like smooth stones placed carefully along a path. She had experience, yes, but more than that. She had composure. When she spoke about managing crises, there was no performance, no over-explanation, just quiet authority. He found himself listening, really listening, and that realization annoyed him. Control, he reminded himself. Keep control. So, he leaned back in his chair, letting his tone sharpen. Our work environment is demanding, structured, some might say, rigid. How well do you function under constant pressure? She didn't flinch. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes, steady, curious, kind. "I've worked under people who believed pressure was the only way to get results," she said softly. "But I've found that calm can be just as powerful. Sometimes. More." Her answer hung in the air. It wasn't defiance. It wasn't submission. It was truth. Ethan felt something tighten in his chest. Not quite irritation. Not quite admiration. A pulse. A reminder that beneath his armor, he was still made of flesh and heartbeat. He shifted in his chair. You seem confident in your approach." Claire smiled again, but this time there was a trace of humor in it. "I am. Confidence isn't the same as rebellion. Mr. Ward, it's just knowing who you are." The words landed with quiet precision. He didn't respond. Couldn't, really. From outside the glass wall, Janet watched the scene unfold, her hands still, her expression unreadable. In all her years beside Ethan Ward, she had never seen him lose his rhythm. But now, as she watched him glance down, then back up again, as if searching for footing on suddenly uneven ground, she thought, well, there it is. A storm under glass. Inside the office, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now, charged, alive, humming between two people who didn't quite understand what had just begun. Ethan tried to end the meeting with efficiency. He thanked her, offered a polite handshake, and said the words that came automatically, "We'll be in touch," but she didn't rise immediately. Instead, she looked around the office, the colorless decor, the sharp lines, the perfection that bordered on emptiness, and said something that caught him off guard. "It's a beautiful view," she said, "but I wonder if it ever feels lonely." The words were gentle, observant, not a challenge, just a truth softly spoken. Ethan's breath stalled for half a second before he masked it with his usual composure. He gave a non-committal nod, a faint smile that didn't reach his eyes. When she finally stood to leave, he found himself watching her walk toward the door, not in the way a man watches beauty, but in the way someone watches light move across a dark room, unsure whether to close the blinds or let it in. The moment she disappeared down the hall, the silence of his kingdom returned, but it didn't feel the same. Something in it had shifted, cracked open just enough to let the air change. Janet re-entered a moment later, file in hand. "Well?" she asked, her tone casual, though her eyes said otherwise. Ethan's reply came after a small pause. "Offer her a 2-week trial," he said. "Executive secretary. Starting Monday?" Janet nodded slowly, biting back the faintest smile. She'd seen that look before, not on Ethan, but on men who'd spent too long behind their own walls. A look that said something had been stirred, whether he liked it or not. As the door closed once again, Ethan sat still, hands folded, gaze fixed on the skyline. Outside, the clouds had begun to break apart, thin streams of light slipping through like uninvited guests. He didn't know what to call the feeling inside him: irritation, curiosity, fascination, only that it refused to leave. It lingered, stubborn and alive, like the faint scent of rain after the storm. And though he would never admit it aloud, Ethan Ward knew that silence, his silence, would never sound quite the same again. The next Monday arrived with its usual precision, same skyline, same quiet hum of elevators, same rhythm of control, and yet something unseen had shifted. Ethan Ward walked into his office expecting the world to behave as it always had, predictable, polished, untouched. But the air carried a new softness, subtle but unmistakable. Claire Monroe was already there, early by 20 minutes, not waiting idly, not seeking to impress, just present. Her desk was organized, but not rigid. Her hands moved with a calm steadiness that felt almost out of place in a building designed for speed and efficiency. "Good morning, Mr. Ward," she said, without looking up, her voice smooth and low, like a song that didn't need melody to soothe. He nodded, answering with a quiet "morning" before stepping into his glass fortress. Yet, even as he sat down, he sensed that something tiny, nearly invisible, was already rearranging itself within his carefully built world. By mid-morning, he began to notice the differences. The harsh fluorescent lights that had long ruled his office were dimmed slightly, replaced by a warmer tone that softened the sharp edges of the room. The peppermint tea now sitting beside his black coffee wasn't something he'd asked for, but it appeared anyway, accompanied by a note in clean handwriting, for when the caffeine feels too loud. He didn't smile, not outwardly. But he left the tea there, untouched, though the faint scent lingered long enough to comfort him in ways he didn't quite understand. His schedule, once a battlefield of overlapping meetings and late-night calls, now ran smoother. Files were labeled more intuitively, reports prepared before he could even request them. Claire didn't ask for permission to make these adjustments. She simply observed, understood, and acted quietly, gracefully. By Thursday, he found himself pausing between tasks, wondering not about deadlines or profits, but about her, about how she noticed things no one else did, about how her presence seemed to slow down the air, as though she'd tuned the tempo of his world to something more human. He kept his gratitude locked behind short, polite words. "Thank you," he'd say. Clipped, efficient. She'd nod, meeting his gaze briefly before returning to her work. But between those brief exchanges, something unsaid began to bloom, a current of awareness neither could name. During one of their afternoon meetings, she stood beside him as they reviewed an upcoming presentation. Their conversation was formal, their tone professional, but when she leaned slightly forward to adjust a slide on his screen, he caught the faintest scent of peppermint and vanilla. It disarmed him. He looked away too quickly. Control, he reminded himself. Always control. But that night, long after she'd left, he found himself replaying that moment, the way her calm seemed to wrap around the room, the way his heart had stuttered in quiet rebellion. He tried to drown it in work, in numbers, in logic, but desire, when it's tethered to respect, doesn't burn fast, it simmers. And it was simmering now, quietly, beneath the surface. He told himself it was a distraction. He even whispered it once under his breath, as though saying it aloud might weaken its hold. This is a distraction, but his voice lacked conviction, because deep down, something older was stirring, something his mother's rules had buried long ago. In his mind, he heard her again, her voice crisp, distant, commanding. Softness weakens men. Ethan, you must never let it in. He was 10 years old again, standing beside her at a formal dinner. She'd watched him hug his Aunt Lila, a woman with kind eyes and a fuller frame, and afterward, she'd pulled him aside, her manicured hand cold on his shoulder. "People will judge you by who you stand next to," she had said. "Choose wisely, appear strong." The memory still carried the faint scent of her perfume, white gardenia, and disapproval. It had followed him into adulthood, into every office, every relationship he never allowed to begin. And yet now, decades later, he found himself drawn to a woman whose very existence contradicted that cruel lesson. Claire's softness wasn't weakness. It was presence. It was steadiness. It was everything he'd been told to avoid and everything he didn't know he needed. By Friday evening, he found himself watching her through the glass wall of his office. She was organizing the week's final reports, her brow slightly furrowed in focus. The city behind her glowed with the last blush of sunset gold turning to amber, fading into deep blue. For a moment, he didn't see an employee. He saw peace, something rare, something unmanufactured, and before he could stop himself, his thoughts whispered words he would never say aloud. "You don't belong in my world of walls." But God, how I wish you did. Then, as if sensing the weight of his gaze, she looked up. Their eyes met through the glass just for a heartbeat. Neither smiled, neither looked away. Then she turned back to her work, leaving him with that quiet ache again, the one that had no name, the one that made him question whether control was truly the same as safety. Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling a long, measured breath. Outside, the city kept moving, lights flickering, people rushing, life unfolding in all its unpredictable rhythm. But inside the 32nd floor, time slowed. The kingdom of order had met the warmth of humanity. And for the first time, the man who built walls to keep the world out began to wonder what it might feel like to let someone in. The following week unfolded quietly, or at least, that's how it seemed, on the surface. Ethan Ward's world moved as it always had: meetings, reports, numbers, deadlines. But beneath that polished rhythm, something had begun to stir, a shift so delicate it could only be felt, not seen. The staff noticed first. It started with small things. Ethan, who once treated conversation like wasted breath, now paused to listen when someone spoke. He asked for input during meetings. He, even to everyone's quiet astonishment, laughed once. It wasn't much, just a brief, startled laugh that escaped before he could stop it. But in an office where silence had long been the rule, it felt like a thunderclap. Rumors rippled softly through the hallways. Something was different about Mr. Ward. No one said it aloud, but they all knew what had changed, or rather, who had changed it. Claire Monroe moved through the building with her usual calm, unaware or perhaps unwilling to acknowledge the quiet orbit she had become in Ethan's world. She didn't seek attention, didn't play games, but wherever she went, the atmosphere followed lighter, more human. Janet, ever observant, had seen this kind of change before, though never in Ethan. She'd served by his side for nearly a decade, watching him keep the world at arm's length. But now, she caught glimpses of something new, a flicker of warmth behind the glass, a hesitation before the mask slid back into place. One afternoon, as the office buzzed with the soft clatter of keyboards and distant phone calls, Janet decided to speak. She entered his office without knocking one of the few privileges she'd earned. Ethan looked up, his expression neutral, pen poised mid-air. "What is it?" "Janet." She closed the door behind her, crossing her arms. "You like her," she said simply. He blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me, Claire," she continued, her tone steady, matter of fact. "You like her? Admit it before it turns messy." Ethan leaned back in his chair, the faintest trace of a smirk ghosting his lips. "That's absurd." "Is it?" Janet tilted her head. "Because the last time I saw you linger in a hallway, you were waiting for a board member, and now you linger when she's near." He didn't answer. His gaze drifted toward the window, instead the glass reflecting his own composed image back at him. But what he saw there wasn't control. It was the faintest crack, a man trying too hard to look unchanged. "Whatever you think you're seeing," he said finally, voice low, "you're mistaken." Janet sighed. But there was kindness in it. "Ethan, you've spent years building a fortress around yourself. Maybe it's time you asked who you're protecting and what you're keeping out." She left without waiting for a reply. And once again, he was alone with his reflection, a stranger wearing his face. That Friday, just before an important investor presentation, Claire stopped by his office. He was pacing, rare for him, or scanning slides, notes, numbers. "You're overthinking it," she said gently, stepping inside. He looked up, slightly irritated by her calm. "I don't overthink," she smiled faintly. "You do today." He exhaled, setting the tablet down. "The investors expect precision. I can't afford to be human." She interrupted softly. The words hung between them. He wanted to argue, to retreat into logic, but her gaze, steady and knowing, disarmed him. She moved closer, pointing at his presentation on the screen. "Here," she said, adjusting one of the graphs. "You're explaining the numbers, but not the story behind them. People remember stories, not statistics." Their hands brushed, just lightly, a passing contact, barely there. But it was enough. A spark, an uninvited warmth that caught him completely off guard. For a heartbeat. The air between them shifted. The distance he'd kept so carefully all these years collapsed into a silence that said too much. He stepped back first. "Thank you," he murmured, voice tight. "That'll be all." She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Of course, Mr. Ward." As she left, her reflection crossed his in the glass. Hers calm, his fractured. When the door clicked shut, he pressed a hand to the cool surface, staring at the faint ghost of her outline fading from view. Control equals safety. He repeated the words like a prayer, though each time they sounded less like truth and more like fear. From her side of the glass wall, Claire returned to her desk, fingers still tingling from that accidental touch. She didn't believe in office romances. She didn't believe in saving men who didn't want to be saved, but she also didn't believe in pretending she hadn't seen what she saw in his eyes, the quiet storm, the man at war with himself. She sensed his struggle not between desire and restraint, but between the person he was told to be and the one he might still become. And somehow, she understood that her presence had unearthed something deeper than attraction. It was recognition, two souls shaped by silence, trying to find a language that didn't wound. That night, as the office lights dimmed and the city glittered beyond the glass, Claire gathered her things and glanced back once. Through the darkened pane, she could see him still working, still trying to pretend that order could replace feeling. He didn't look up, but even from across the room, she could sense the ache in his stillness. A crack had formed, not loud, not visible, but real. And through that crack, the first trace of light had begun to seep in. That night, the city shimmered below like a restless sea of light cars gliding through the rain, windows glowing in lonely rhythm. Ethan Ward stood by the glass, his reflection layered over the skyline, a ghost caught between two worlds. He should have gone home hours ago, but instead, he stayed trapped in that strange silence Claire Monroe had left behind. Every time he tried to focus on numbers or charts, her voice slipped through the cracks. Sometimes, calm is more powerful than pressure. It wasn't defiance, it was truth, and it echoed in him now, like a quiet rebellion against everything he'd built his life upon. He closed his eyes for a moment, and that's when it happened. The sound of the rain against the window carried him backward into a different kind of storm. He was 8 years old again. The ballroom smelled of roses and perfume, of polished silver and judgment. His mother stood tall beside him, Eleanor Ward, a woman whose elegance filled every room before she even spoke. Her diamonds sparkled like armor. Her smile was never quite real. "Stand up straight. Ethan," she whispered, pressing a firm hand between his shoulders. "No one respects a slouch." He obeyed, as he always did. Across the room, music played softly. Adults laughed in rehearsed tones, and waiters moved like shadows. At one point, his Aunt Lila, his father's sister, spotted him and waved. She was a round woman, kind-eyed, with a laugh that carried warmth instead of polish. He adored her. When she opened her arms, he ran to her without hesitation, wrapping himself around her waist. For one pure, unmeasured moment, he felt safe, but then came the cold tap on his shoulder. "Ethan," his mother's voice soft, but dangerous. He turned. She was smiling, but her eyes were steel. "That's enough," Lila chuckled, unaware of the frost gathering behind them. "He's such a sweetheart." "Eleanor, you've raised him well." "Yes," his mother replied, voice smooth as glass, "though he still has much to learn about appearances." Later, when they were alone, she crouched to his level, her perfume sharp and suffocating. "Listen carefully, darling," she said. "People are judged by who they stand beside. You can't afford to look foolish. You're a ward." He didn't fully understand. He only knew that the warmth he'd felt moments ago now carried the sting of shame. And from that day forward, he learned to measure every gesture, every word, every breath not by what felt right, but by how it would be seen. Years later, his father's quiet absence would teach him the rest. A man who rarely spoke, who never fought, never stayed. He'd fade into background photos, always near the edge of the frame, never at the center. Control, Ethan decided, was the only thing that could keep a person from disappearing. He built his empire on that belief. Every rule, every cold habit, every layer of armor, all born from a boy's fear of being humiliated for his softness. But now, decades later, as rain traced silver lines down the glass, those old voices began to whisper again. His mother's voice, still sharp, still unforgiving. "Softness weakens men. You're judged by who you're seen with." And each time he looked at Claire Monroe, that echo returned, a cruel ghost rising inside him. She didn't fit the rules he had been taught to honor. She wasn't polished perfection. She was grace without pretense, beauty without performance. And that somehow terrified him more than any boardroom or billion-dollar risk. Because every time she smiled at him, every time her calm brushed against his chaos, he felt that boy inside him, the one who once reached for kindness and was told no. He saw Claire and felt both hunger and guilt, desire, yes, but also the deep ache of unlearning. He found himself standing at the edge of his own reflection, torn between instinct and awakening. His attraction was undeniable, but so was the shame woven into it, not toward her, but toward what she represented. He whispered her name once, just to hear how it sounded in the air. Claire. The syllable felt forbidden, yet strangely holy. The next morning, he arrived at the office earlier than usual, hoping the sharp rhythm of work would drown out memory. It didn't. Everywhere he looked, traces of her presence lingered. The gentle light she'd chosen for the office, the peppermint tea she'd restocked without asking, even the way his team moved now less tense, more alive. It was as if she had changed not just the air around him, but the rhythm inside his chest. At one point, she passed his door, offering a polite smile. He returned it, barely but afterward. He caught his reflection in the glass again, and what he saw unsettled him. Not the CEO, not the perfectionist, but a man who no longer recognized his own armor. He touched the glass lightly, tracing the faint outline of his reflection. "Who are you now?" he whispered. And though the question hung unanswered, something inside him stirred a truth he'd been running from since childhood. Control had never kept him safe. It had only kept him alone. That night, as he left the office, he saw Claire waiting for the elevator. She looked up and smiled, that same quiet smile that never asked, only offered. For a moment, he wanted to speak, to tell her that every part of him was at war, the man his mother raised and the man she had somehow awakened. But he didn't. He simply nodded, stepping into the elevator beside her. The silence between them was soft, heavy, alive, and in that silence, he realized something he hadn't dared admit. The past wasn't gone. It was still here, alive in every hesitation, every rule, every breath. And until he faced it, love, true love, would always stand just on the other side of the glass. The next week began quietly, too quietly, as if the city were holding its breath before a storm. Inside, Ward Enterprises. The hum of routine filled the earphones ringing, doors closing, footsteps moving in practiced rhythm. But beneath that surface calm, something was beginning to fray. By mid-morning, the crisis struck. A shipment delay 3 weeks behind schedule threatened the launch of their largest client contract. Millions of dollars, months of preparation, and the company's reputation were suddenly at risk. The news hit Ethan's office like a thunderclap. He stood rigid behind his desk, jaw tight, eyes scanning the report on his screen. The numbers blurred. Every instinct in him screamed for control, for precision, for someone to blame. Who approved this route, he demanded. No one answered right away. The room felt smaller, colder. Then Claire's voice calm, even like steady rain after lightning. "Let's take a breath," she said. He turned toward her, irritation flashing across his face. "A breath isn't going to fix this." "No," she replied softly. "But panic won't either." Her tone didn't challenge him, it grounded him. It was as though she dropped an anchor in the middle of chaos. She moved closer to the table, scanning the data, her expression thoughtful. "We still have leverage," she murmured. "If we handle this right, we can keep the client." Within minutes, she was on the phone, her voice measured, her words deliberate. Ethan watched as she spoke with the overseas partners, her tone never rising, her pauses timed perfectly. Where he used force, she used grace. Where he demanded, she invited. And somehow, she got what she needed. By the time she hung up, the tension in the room had shifted. "The shipment will arrive within 72 hours, she said calmly. "They're rerouting. I'll stay in touch with their logistics team until it's confirmed." Ethan blinked. "You did that? Just now?" She smiled faintly. Sometimes, people just need to be heard. For the first time that day, he exhaled. The fire inside him, that constant restless drive for control, cooled into something quieter. He looked at her then, really looked not at her curves, not at the surface of who she was, but at her composure, her strength. He saw the steadiness that lived beneath her softness, and it undid him a little. "Thank you," he said finally. The words came rough, unpracticed, but sincere. She nodded, gathering her notes. "You're welcome." Then, before leaving, she added gently, "You should breathe more often, Mr. Ward." He didn't answer, but her words followed him long after she was gone. That evening, the office emptied one by one. Rain brushed against the tall windows, streaking them in silver. Ethan stayed behind, unable to shake the weight that sat between his shoulder blades, the exhaustion of a man who had lived too long on edge. He found Claire still at her desk, typing quietly under the soft glow of her lamp. She looked up when he approached, her expression open but cautious. "You're still here?" he said. "So are you." She replied with a gentle smile. He hesitated before speaking again. "About earlier. I don't handle pressure well." "Not anymore." She closed her laptop and gestured toward the chair opposite her. "Sit." He raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me." "Sit," she repeated. "You need to reset," for reasons he didn't understand. He obeyed. She folded her hands together, inhaling deeply. "You're holding your breath again," she said softly. "Most people don't notice when they do that." "I'm not," he began, but stopped. She was right. His chest felt tight, his pulse too fast. "Close your eyes," she said. "Inhale for 4 counts, hold for 2, exhale for 6. He almost laughed. The idea of Ethan Ward doing breathing exercises was absurd, but her voice left no room for argument. So, he did it. Inhale, hold, exhale, once, twice. By the 3rd cycle, something inside him loosened. The storm that had lived in his body for years began to settle, just enough to let the quiet in. When he opened his eyes, she was watching him not with pity, but with understanding. "How does that feel?" she asked. "Strange," he admitted, "but lighter." She smiled. "That's what calm does. It doesn't erase the fire, it just teaches it not to burn you." Her words lingered, fire and calm. That was what she was, the balance he never knew he needed. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. Ethan's eyes drifted toward her hands, strong, steady, resting lightly on her lap. He wanted to reach for them, but he didn't. Instead, he said the only truth he could manage. "You make things better." She looked away, a flicker of something unreadable crossing her face. "That's my job." But her voice betrayed a hint of emotion, something she tried and failed to hide. Later that night, as she packed her things, she glanced through the glass wall into his office. He was still sitting there, a man carved from contradictions, ice and fire, logic and longing. She knew better than to fall for someone like him. But still, she couldn't help but think under all that armor, there was a good man trying to find his way back to himself. As she turned off her lamp, she whispered under her breath, "He's not cold. He's just afraid to thaw." And somewhere, behind the glass, Ethan looked up as if he'd heard. That night, for the first time in years, he slept. No dreams of his mother's voice, no echoes of shame, just the quiet rhythm of breathing, 4 in, 2 hold, 6 out, and the faint memory of peppermint and calm that had somehow found its way into his soul. Fire and ice no longer enemies, but uneasy companions. And in the stillness that followed, Ethan Ward began to understand maybe peace wasn't the absence of chaos. Maybe it was simply learning to let warmth exist within it. The rain returned the next evening, steady, unhurried, painting silver trails down the tall glass windows of Ward Enterprises. It was nearly 10 o'clock, long past the hour when most of the building slept, but 2 lights still burned on the 32nd floor. Ethan Ward was at his desk, sleeves rolled, tie loosened. The glow of the city reflected against his glass walls, mingling with the faint hum of jazz playing from his phone. Across the room, Claire Monroe sat surrounded by folders and notes, Her posture relaxed, yet focused that quiet determination that always seemed to center him. Neither spoke for a while. Only the soft rhythm of rain and the clicking of keyboards filled the space. It should have felt ordinary another late night at work, yet it didn't. Something had changed. Something unspoken lingered in the air between them. When Ethan finally looked up from his screen, she was staring out the window, the city lights glimmering in her eyes. "You should go home," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. She smiled faintly without turning around. "You first?" He chuckled softly, that rare, quiet laugh that still startled him when it escaped. "You're impossible," he murmured. "I've been called worse," she replied, glancing at him now. Their eyes met a pause, not long, but long enough to feel the weight of it. And just like that, the invisible line between professionalism and something far deeper began to blur. "Can I ask you something?" Claire said suddenly, breaking the silence. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Of course." She hesitated, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. "Have you ever felt out of place, like no matter how hard you work, someone always sees what you're not instead of what you are?" The question caught him off guard. He tilted his head, studying her expression, calm, but fragile around the edges. "I suppose," he said slowly, "but I've learned not to let it matter." She gave a small, sad smile. "I tried that too." He didn't speak, waiting. Claire drew in a breath, her voice softer now. "The truth is, I left my last job because I was told I didn't fit the image." Ethan froze. She continued, eyes distant. "They said I was good at what I did, but that I didn't look the part. Not sleek enough, not polished enough. Too ordinary to sit at the executive table." He felt the words cut through him, deeper than she could have known. The air seemed to tighten. That old echo rose inside him again, his mother's voice, cold and elegant. "You're judged by who you're seen with." He swallowed hard. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "You didn't deserve that." Claire shrugged lightly, but her eyes shimmered. "Most people like to talk about empowerment. Few of them mean it." For a long moment, neither moved. The rain outside deepened, a steady percussion against glass. Ethan's gaze softened. "You know, when you first walked in here, I told myself you were a distraction." She looked at him, curious. And now he hesitated, then spoke the truth before he could stop himself. "Now I realize you're the only thing that makes this place feel alive." The confession hung in the air, fragile as glass. Claire's lips parted slightly, a breath caught somewhere between surprise and restraint. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood and walked to the window, arms folded loosely. "You shouldn't say things like that, Ethan," she said softly. "Not if you don't mean them." "I mean them," he said. The words came too fast, too raw. "I just don't know what to do with them." He rose from his chair, moving closer, but stopped a few feet away. The faint reflection of both of them shimmered in the glass. Two silhouettes, close but not touching, their reflections nearly merging with the city beyond. He could smell her perfume light, unassuming, like warm linen after rain. His hand twitched at his side, instinct begging for something his mind refused to allow. "I don't know what this is," he admitted, voice low, "but it's not professional." She turned then, eyes meeting his calm, but filled with something deep and unguarded. "Then stop hiding behind professionalism," she whispered. The room fell utterly still. The sound of rain, the faint hum of city lights, the rise and fall of two uncertain breaths, that was all that existed. And in that stillness, everything that had been restrained between them surged forward in silence. He took half a step closer, but she shook her head not harshly, just enough. "Don't," she said, "not unless you're ready for what it means." Her words landed like a truth he'd spent a lifetime avoiding. She turned away, gathering her things slowly. He wanted to stop her, to explain that he wasn't ready, not because he didn't feel, but because he felt too much. But his voice failed him. Claire. She paused at the door, looking back over her shoulder, her eyes softened. You're not the only one who's afraid. Ethan, the difference is, I don't let fear make my choices for me. And then she was gone. The door closed gently, leaving only the echo of her footsteps fading down the corridor. Ethan stood motionless, staring at the rain sliding down the glass, tracing paths that seemed to mirror the cracks in his composure. He could still feel her presence, the warmth she left behind, the challenge in her voice, the truth in her eyes. For years, he'd prided himself on being unshakable, a man built of discipline and distance. But tonight, with the rain whispering outside and the ghost of her words still burning in his chest, he realized something he'd never allowed himself to say. The walls he built to protect himself were the same walls keeping him from everything he wanted. And somewhere in the dark reflection of the glass, he saw it, the faint outline of a man beginning to break, not from weakness, but from finally learning what it meant to feel. The rain didn't stop that night. It whispered against the windows long after Claire had gone, filling the silence she left behind. Ethan stayed there, standing motionless in the middle of his office long after the city's lights dimmed and the streets below turned silver with water. Every word she'd said replayed in his mind like an echo that refused to fade, then stop hiding behind professionalism. The difference is, I don't let fear make my choices for me. He tried to work, he tried to read, but the words blurred, meaningless on the page. At some point, near midnight, he sat down not at his desk, but by the window, where he could watch the rain fall. It struck him how easy it was to confuse control with strength, and how, for years, he'd mistaken silence for peace. He closed his eyes, resting his head against the cool glass, and for the first time in years, he didn't feel like the man in charge. He just felt human and terribly, unbearably alone. The next morning came gray and heavy. Seattle's skyline was veiled in mist, the kind that blurs the horizon and hides the world in soft uncertainty. Ethan arrived earlier than usual. He told himself it was out of habit, that he was simply getting a head start on the day. But deep down, he knew why. He hoped, foolishly, that last night hadn't been an ending. As the elevator doors slid open onto the executive floor, he noticed it immediately. Her desk empty. No files, no mug of peppermint tea, no gentle scent of her perfume that used to linger faintly in the air. Only the faint outline where her notebook used to rest and a single sealed envelope, placed neatly in the center of the desk. For a long moment, he just stared at it. He didn't reach for it, didn't move, because somehow, touching it would make it real. Finally, with slow, deliberate hands, he picked it up and broke the seal. Her handwriting clean, steady, familiar, filled the page. You were right, Ethan, this isn't professional. But it was real. I wish you could see yourself the way I did, not as the man who hides, but the one who almost let himself be seen. Maybe one day, you'll stop fighting the very thing that could save you. Claire. He read the words twice, then 3 times. Each time, the ache in his chest grew heavier, like something tightening from the inside out. Real. That word stayed with him. It wasn't love, not yet, but it had been real, and now it was gone. The office felt different that day. Not chaotic, not broken, just empty. People moved quieter. The warmth she'd brought into the space, almost without anyone noticing, had vanished. The little moments, her laughter near the coffee machine, the way she softened the tone of meetings, the calm she carried like sunlight, were all gone. The air had gone back to being still, controlled, sterile. It was as if the building had exhaled her name and gone back to holding its breath. Janet noticed first. She'd seen Ethan's car in the lot before sunrise, knew what that meant. When she walked into the office and saw him standing by Claire's empty desk, holding the letter, she didn't ask what had happened. She already knew. She approached slowly, her voice gentle but firm. She's gone. He nodded once. Yes. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Janet sighed, not out of surprise, but out of a sadness that came from understanding. "You know," she said softly, "you didn't lose her because you broke the rule." He looked up, confused. "What do you mean?" She met his eyes. "You lost her because the rule broke you." The words landed hard. He wanted to argue, to explain that rules were what kept him and everyone else safe. But as he looked around the room at the perfect order, the clean lines, the silence that once comforted him, he realized she was right. For years, those rules had been his armor. But now, standing in this empty office, they felt more like a cage. The day dragged on. Meetings blurred together. Emails went unanswered. Everywhere he went, the absence of her shadow followed him. In the elevator, he remembered her quiet laugh. In the hallway, he heard the faint echo of her heels. At his desk, he imagined her voice, calm and steady. "You should breathe more often." By evening, the rain had returned softer this time, like the sky was tired too. Ethan stayed late again, though there was nothing left to stay for. The city outside glowed in shades of gray and silver. He stood by the window, watching raindrops slide down the glass in crooked lines. For once, he didn't straighten them in his mind. He just let them fall. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell rang slow, heavy, echoing through the mist. And for the first time since she'd left, Ethan whispered her name, Claire. The sound was small, almost a prayer. But in that moment, it carried everything regret, longing, confusion, hope. He didn't know if he'd see her again, didn't know if she'd ever forgive him, or if forgiveness was even what he needed. All he knew was that his kingdom of silence had never felt so hollow. He pressed his palm to the glass, the same place she'd once stood, the same place he'd watched her reflection fade. The surface was cold, slick with rain, but behind it, something warm still flickered, fragile, persistent, alive. Maybe this was what breaking felt like, not destruction, but awakening. And as the rain whispered on, the man who had once believed control was safety began, at last, to wonder if love in all its wild imperfection was the only real kind of freedom. The rain had stopped by morning, but the quiet it left behind was heavier than sound. For days, Ethan Ward moved through his penthouse the same way he once moved through his office, precise, mechanical, detached, every motion measured, every breath timed. But inside, the rhythm that had once defined him had lost its beat. The empty office had followed him home. It echoed in the quiet spaces, the sound of untouched coffee cooling on the counter, the faint hum of the city far below, the silence of a phone that no longer lit up with her name. He had told himself he preferred solitude. Now, it felt like drowning in air. At night, sleep refused him. He'd lie awake in the dark, the ceiling dimly lit by the pulse of streetlights outside, and the voices would return. His mother's voice sharp, clipped, polished like cut glass. Softness weakens men. You're judged by who you're seen with. And then, like a softer current beneath it, Claire's voice. Then stop hiding behind professionalism. You should breathe more often. Two voices, two worlds. And somewhere in between them stood the man he'd become, suspended between shame and longing, control and release. Sometimes, he caught himself wondering what she was doing. If she'd found another job, if she ever thought of him when the rain fell against her window. He'd told himself he wasn't afraid of her, of what she represented, of the feelings she'd stirred in him. But as the sleepless nights stretched on, truth began to rise from the silence like light through fog. He wasn't afraid of her. He was afraid of himself with her, because when she was near, the armor cracked, and underneath it, he wasn't the man he'd spent his life perfecting. He was something raw, unguarded, real, and real terrified him. By the end of that week, the loneliness began to take form, not loud, not dramatic, but steady and persistent, like water wearing down stone. He'd sit at the piano he never played, running his fingers along the keys without pressing them. He'd stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows at night, staring out at the lights of Seattle, each one a reminder of how full the world was and how small his had become. Once, success had been enough. Now, it felt hollow, a stage lit for a play that had already ended. He thought about the letter she'd left, folded neatly on her desk. It wasn't professional, but it was real. That line haunted him more than any reprimand ever could, because deep down, he knew she hadn't left because he'd broken a rule. She'd left because he'd refused to break one that never should have existed. It was a Thursday night when the turning point came. He was scrolling absent-mindedly through his emails, half-reading proposals, half ignoring his reflection in the black screen when something caught his eye. A newsletter from the Seattle Arts Foundation. He almost deleted it until the subject line froze him in place. Annual Women's Leadership Gala, guest speaker Claire Monroe. For a long moment, he didn't move. The cursor blinked beside her name, like a heartbeat. He clicked the link. A photo appeared. Claire, standing on a stage, speaking into a microphone. Her expression calm, her posture strong, the same quiet grace he remembered. She wasn't just there, she belonged there. And for the first time, Ethan saw her not through the lens of his own confusion or desire, but through the truth of who she was, a woman who had found her own voice, even after being told to fit someone else's image. A flicker of something deep stirred inside him, pride, admiration, regret, and beneath it all, a pull not toward control this time, but toward understanding. He leaned back in his chair, the glow of the screen reflecting in his eyes. The city outside shimmered, but his mind was far from it. He whispered into the stillness, "You didn't run, did you?" Claire. You just kept walking forward. The words tasted strange humility mixed with awe. He stared at the photo again, at the woman who had quietly undone everything he thought he knew about strength. And for the first time in years, Ethan Ward felt something unfamiliar, the desire not to rebuild what he'd lost, but to rebuild himself. That night, he stood before the mirror in his bedroom, the same mirror that had reflected his carefully constructed image for years. The man staring back wasn't the same one who'd once prided himself on discipline and distance. His eyes looked older, yes, but softer. The lines on his face weren't from control. They were from holding too much in for too long. He studied that reflection for a long while before speaking aloud, as though testing the words for truth. "I wasn't afraid of her," he said quietly. "I was afraid of me, with her." The admission didn't break him. It released him. For the first time, the mirror didn't show a man trapped behind expectations. It showed one finally ready to step beyond them. By morning, the decision was made. He found the gala invitation again, read every detail, and clicked RSVP. No hesitation this time. He didn't know what he would say when he saw her, or if she'd even want to hear him. But he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Some things, once real, deserved to be faced. As the confirmation email arrived, Ethan closed his laptop and walked to the window. The city was waking, light creeping slowly across the skyline. Somewhere out there, she was preparing for that night, calm, composed, radiant in her own quiet way. And somewhere in here, a man who had once worshipped silence was learning, at last, to speak. He took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and whispered, almost to himself, "It's time." The night of the gala arrived with the kind of quiet anticipation that makes even the air feel dressed for the occasion. Ethan Ward stood in front of the mirror, adjusting his tie with unsteady hands. He hadn't attended a public event in months, not since the walls of his own company had begun to close around him. Now, under the soft glow of his penthouse lights, he looked at the man staring back familiar, but changed. The suit was perfect, the lines sharp, the image immaculate, but something beneath the polish had shifted. There was a new stillness in his eyes, not the cold kind he'd once mistaken for strength, but the fragile calm of a man learning to live without armor. He exhaled slowly, straightened his cuffs, and whispered to the reflection, "Let's see if courage still fits." The Seattle Arts Center gleamed that evening, a cathedral of glass and light nestled against the edge of the bay. Cars glided up to the entrance in a soft parade, the hum of conversation and violin music spilling into the crisp night air. As Ethan stepped out of his car, The air carried the faint scent of salt and rain, the familiar perfume of the city he had built his life around. And yet, never really seen. Inside, the lobby shimmered with gold light, women in elegant gowns, men in tailored suits. Laughter, champagne, applause, and in the middle of it all, a stage bathed in silver light. He scanned the crowd, and then he saw her, Claire Monroe. She stood near the stage, radiant in a deep navy dress that seemed to move with the air itself. Her caramel hair framed her face in soft waves, her presence unforced, yet commanding. She wasn't the woman who once sat outside his glass office, taking quiet notes. She was something more, the kind of woman who belonged in any room. Not because she fought for it, but because she'd stopped asking for permission to exist. His chest tightened. For a moment, he simply watched her from afar, the crowd blurring around her like she was the only point of focus left in the world. The lights dimmed, and a hush fell across the room. Claire stepped up to the podium, her heels clicking softly against the stage floor. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his pulse matching the rhythm of her calm. She began to speak. "At some point," she said, her voice clear and steady, "many women are told they take up too much space in rooms, in conversations, in dreams. Some shrink to fit. Others stay quiet. But there are a few who learn that their voice isn't noise, it's necessary." A murmur of agreement rippled through the audience. Claire paused, her gaze sweeping gently over the crowd before landing somewhere near the back, near him. "Women aren't distractions," she continued. "They're the difference. The warmth in the cold rooms, the balance to the fire, the reason control can mean compassion, not fear." Ethan's throat tightened. Every word felt like it was being spoken directly to him, a mirror held up to the man he used to be. He thought of the unspoken rules, the rigid order, the sterile office that once reflected his pride. He thought of how she had walked into that world of silence and left it breathing again, and in that moment, he realized she hadn't broken his rules. She'd revealed how wrong they were. When her speech ended, the audience rose to their feet, applause filling the hall like waves against the shore. Ethan didn't clap right away. He just stood there, still, watching her, his heart caught somewhere between admiration and ache. Later, when the crowd had thinned and the music softened, he found her near the edge of the room, standing by a tall window overlooking the water. For a moment, he hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn away, to retreat into the safety of silence. But another part, the one she had awakened, told him he'd been silent long enough. He walked toward her, each step slow, deliberate. When she turned, surprise flickered briefly across her face, followed by composure. "Ethan." Her voice was calm, polite. "You were incredible up there," he said, his tone soft, sincere. "Thank you," she replied, her gaze steady. "I didn't expect to see you here. I wasn't sure I'd come," he admitted. "But I saw your name on the program, and—" he paused, searching for words that didn't sound rehearsed. "And I think I needed to—" She studied him quietly, as though weighing how much of this new version of him she could trust. He took a breath. "You were right, Claire. I was hiding behind walls, not because of the world, but because I didn't want to face myself." Her expression softened, but only slightly. And now she asked. He looked out the window beside her, the city lights reflecting like stars on the water. "Now, I'm trying to learn how to stand in the open, without the armor, without pretending I don't feel." For a moment, neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't sharp this time. It was fragile, like glass warmed by breath. Claire turned to face him fully. Her eyes, once gentle, now carried both grace and distance. "So, what are you going to do now?" "Ethan," she asked. Her question wasn't cruel. It was an invitation one he hadn't yet earned the right to accept. He met her gaze, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know yet, but for the first time, I want to find out." She nodded slowly, a faint smile ghosting at the corners of her mouth. "Then start there." As she turned back toward the window, The soft glow of city light wrapped around her calm, confident, untouchable. Ethan stepped back, giving her space, letting the quiet fill what words could not. When he finally walked out of the arts center that night, the rain had returned gentle, rhythmic, familiar. He didn't rush to his car. He simply stood under the awning, letting the sound of it wash over him. For the first time in his life, Ethan Ward didn't feel the need to control the storm. He just let it fall. And somewhere in the distance, through the hum of rain and city light, he knew that the hardest part was no longer finding her. It was becoming the kind of man who deserved to stand beside her. The night after the gala lingered in Ethan's mind like the aftertaste of something bittersweet, too beautiful to forget, too painful to hold. He didn't sleep. Instead, he sat by the window of his apartment, still dressed in his suit, the city shimmering below like a map of choices he hadn't made. Claire's voice from the evening replayed over and over. Women aren't distractions. They're the difference. And her question, quiet but sharp as truth. So, what are you going to do now? He'd stood there, speechless, because for the first time in years, Ethan Ward, the man who always had an answer, didn't. Now, in the soft hours before dawn, he stared out at the sleeping skyline, wondering how to bridge the distance between regret and redemption. The following week, work resumed as usual, or so it seemed. The meetings ran on time, the reports came in clean, the phones rang, decisions were made, but nothing felt the same. Every time Ethan walked past the glass wall of his office, he caught the faint reflection of himself, a man halfway between who he was and who he might still become. He had told Claire that night that he wanted to find out. Now it was time to start proving it. It began with a letter, or, more precisely, an email. He wrote it 3 times before sending, deleted it once, rewrote it again, stripping out every trace of formality, every hint of business polish. When he was done, the message was simple. Subject, an invitation. Claire, I know I have no right to ask this, but I'd like the chance to work with you again, not because of guilt, but because I believe in what you bring into a room. I'm creating a new position. Vice President of Communications. I can't think of anyone more qualified or more necessary than you. Whatever your answer, know this. You change the way I lead. Ethan, he stared at it for a long while before pressing send. When he did, the silence in his office deepened, not heavy this time, but expectant, like holding one's breath before a tide returns. Days passed. Each morning, he checked his inbox, pretending he wasn't waiting. Each evening, he left his office later than he should, pretending he wasn't disappointed. Then, on a Thursday afternoon, her reply arrived. Just one short message, no greeting, no signature, no warmth to hide behind. If I never walked into your office again, would I still matter? He read it once, then again, and again. Each time, the question struck deeper, not because he didn't understand it, but because he did. She wasn't testing him. She wasn't rejecting him. She was asking for truth. He set the phone down and leaned back in his chair, eyes closed. In the quiet, his thoughts began to unravel years of conditioning, rules, walls, and fears, all colliding at once. He'd offered her a title, a position, a place beside him in the world he'd built. But that wasn't what she wanted. She didn't want a title that meant belonging to him. She wanted to know if she still mattered without him. And in that realization, Ethan saw the heart of it all, the flaw that had lived inside every decision he'd ever made. He'd spent his entire life defining people by what they were to him, not who they were on their own. Employees, partners, images, reflections, even Claire. He thought he'd been offering her respect. But in truth, he'd been offering her a safer version of himself, the man still hiding behind structure and control, the one who couldn't love without measuring it. The room around him felt suddenly smaller, the hum of the air vent, the faint ticking of the wall clock. The same walls that had once made him feel powerful now seemed to echo his own emptiness back at him. He picked up his phone again, rereading her line until it blurred. "If I never walked into your office again, would I still matter?" He whispered the words aloud, and for the first time, the answer came without hesitation. "Yes," he said quietly. "You would." The sound of his own voice startled him, soft, sincere, unguarded. He realized it wasn't her forgiveness he was waiting for anymore. It was his own honesty. That evening, he didn't stay late. He closed his laptop at 5, walked out into the fading light, and found himself driving without direction through the quiet streets of Seattle, past the water where the city lights danced like restless stars. He ended up by the waterfront, where the air smelled of salt and pine. He parked, rolled down the window, and let the cold wind wash over him. The reflection in the dark glass of the car window caught his eye. His face, older but freer somehow, not perfect, not polished, just human. He remembered the man he'd been when she first walked into his office, rigid, proud, distant. And he thought of the man he was now still learning, still flawed, but open. The difference wasn't in what he'd gained, it was in what he'd finally been willing to lose. Back at his apartment, he poured a glass of wine and sat down by the window again, the same spot where he'd once stared out at the rain, feeling empty. Now, the night felt different. Not healed, not whole, but honest. He opened his laptop one more time and typed a reply. This one without the weight of titles or the armor of professionalism. "Yes, Claire, you'd still matter. You always did. If you ever decide to walk back into my life, I promise it won't be through the office door." He hovered over the send button for a moment, then pressed it and leaned back, letting out a long breath. There was no victory in it, no sense of winning her back or rewriting the past. Only the quiet relief of a man who had finally chosen truth over control, and for Ethan Ward, that was enough. Days passed after Ethan sent that last message, simple, honest, unguarded. He didn't expect a reply, and for once, he didn't need one. There was something freeing in letting truth exist without the need for outcome. Still, every morning, he found himself glancing at his phone before the day began, not with impatience, but with quiet hope. Then, one evening, just as the sky faded from blue to the soft gray of twilight, a message appeared. "I read your email. I'm not sure what to say yet." He read those 2 lines again, smiling faintly. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't closure, but it was a door open, just enough for light to spill through. A week later, he sent another message. "Can I show you something that matters to me?" He stared at the screen, thumb hovering over send. It wasn't a request made out of strategy or longing. It was an invitation, honest and bare. He pressed send. This time, her reply came sooner than he expected. "All right, just 2 words." But for Ethan, they felt like a second chance at breathing. The following morning, he drove south away from the skyline, away from the mirrored glass towers that had once defined him, past the traffic, past the rush of the city, until the air began to change. By the time he crossed into Oregon, the scent of the sea had found him that unmistakable blend of salt, wind, and memory. The house stood quietly at the edge of the coast. It wasn't large or modern, no marble, no chrome, no walls of glass, just weathered wood, a wide porch, and the sound of waves rolling against the rocks below. He hadn't been there in years. His father had bought it once, long ago, before he disappeared from their lives. Back then, it had been Ethan's place of escape where the boy who wasn't allowed to feel could finally breathe. Now, standing barefoot on the porch, he felt that same air wrap around him, cold, briny, alive. He took off his jacket, rolled his sleeves, and let the wind undo what order remained. For the first time in decades, he wasn't Mr. Ward. He was just a man. When Claire's car pulled up near noon, he was sitting on the porch steps, coffee in hand, eyes fixed on the horizon. She stepped out slowly, her hair catching the light breeze, her expression calm but cautious. Neither spoke right away. The only sound was the sea steady, timeless, patient. He stood, offering a small, uncertain smile. You found it? She nodded, looking around. It's beautiful. It's honest, he said softly. That's rarer. I think. She looked at him, then really looked and saw something different. Gone was the polished perfection, the crisp authority of the man behind the glass walls. This Ethan looked human, barefoot, sleeves rolled, vulnerability woven into every gesture. They sat together on the porch, a respectful distance apart, the sea stretching endlessly before them. The conversation began lightly about the drive, the weather, the quiet rhythm of the waves, but beneath the surface, a current of something deeper moved a question neither had asked aloud. Why here finally? She broke the silence. Why did you bring me? He took a breath, eyes fixed on the water. Because this is where I come when I need to remember who I am. He glanced at her, voice steady but soft. I spent years trying to build a life that looked perfect from the outside. But it wasn't living. It was performing. Every rule, every line, every bit of control. It was all just armor. Claire listened quietly, the wind tugging gently at her hair. He continued. When you left, I kept telling myself it was about professionalism or image or the company, but it wasn't. I just didn't know how to be seen without the mask. He looked down at his hands. They say power makes people untouchable. Maybe that's true, but it also makes them lonely. The truth hung in the salt air between them, unpolished, unguarded. For a moment, Claire didn't speak. She simply watched the waves break and reform, the same way his words seemed to. I didn't leave to punish you, she said quietly. I left because I couldn't keep watching you fight yourself. Every time you looked at me, I saw the man you could be and the one you were still trying to hide. Her voice softened. You don't need to prove anything to me. Ethan, you just need to be real. He smiled faintly. That's the hardest part. I know, she replied, but maybe that's where it starts. They sat in silence again, listening to the surf. Gulls circled overhead, their cries carried by the wind. Somewhere behind them, the screen door creaked softly in the breeze. Ethan turned toward her, his tone quiet, almost shy. Would you like to see something? She raised an eyebrow. Depends what it is. He gestured toward the path leading down to the beach. Come on. I promise it's not another office. She laughed that warm, unguarded laugh he hadn't realized he missed so much. They walked side by side down the narrow wooden steps, the boards soft and uneven underfoot. When they reached the sand, he pointed to a small driftwood bench half buried near the rocks. I built that with my dad when I was 12, he said. He didn't say much, but for once, he didn't have to. We just worked side by side. No rules, no lessons, just quiet. Claire traced her fingers along the weathered wood, eyes gentle. It's still standing, she said. Barely. He admitted, but maybe that's the point. They stood there, the waves touching their feet, the wind threading between them like something sacred. For the first time since they'd met, there was no power between them, no hierarchy, no distance, just two people, stripped of everything that didn't matter. And in that simple, salt-wash silence, Ethan felt something shift, not grand or dramatic, but quietly profound. He realized he didn't need to win her back. He just needed to be the kind of man who could stand beside her barefoot, honest, and free. The sea grew quieter as the sun began to fall, spreading ribbons of gold and amber across the horizon. Ethan and Claire stood side by side, the waves brushing softly against the sand, two silhouettes drawn together by something larger than words. For a while, neither spoke. The air between them felt fragile, sacred. It wasn't awkwardness. It was the quiet that comes when truth is waiting its turn to be heard. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. Do you ever wonder, he said softly, how much of who we are isn't really ours? Claire turned toward him, her expression calm, open. What do you mean? He looked out toward the horizon. My whole life. I've been living by someone else's definition of strength. My mother's. My father's absence. My own fear of what softness might take from me. He drew a slow breath, the sound of the sea almost swallowing his words. I was raised to believe that control was survival, that if you showed too much kindness, too much emotion, people would see it as weakness and use it against you. He gave a small, bitter smile. Turns out, the only one who used it against me was myself. Claire said nothing. She didn't move closer or pull away. She simply listened, the kind of listening that feels like permission. Ethan's gaze drifted down to the sand at his feet. My mother used to say that love made men foolish. She believed discipline was the only way to be respected. Every rule I've ever made, every wall I've ever built, came from her voice, not mine. He paused, eyes glistening in the fading light. When you walked into my office, Claire, I told myself you were a distraction because you reminded me of everything she said I should never want. Warmth, softness, humanity. He turned toward her now, his voice low but steady. I tried to keep my distance, not because I didn't care, but because caring felt like betrayal. Betrayal of the man I thought I had to be. A wave broke near the shore, scattering spray around their feet. Ethan didn't flinch. He just stared at the horizon, letting the confession roll out of him slow, deliberate, unfiltered. For so long, I believed I was in control, but I wasn't. His throat tightened and his voice faltered. I was terrified of being seen, of being known, of losing the image I'd spent years building. You weren't the exception. Claire, you were the lesson. The words hung between them, trembling with weight. Claire's eyes softened, but she didn't reach for him. She stayed still, letting the silence breathe around them. Ethan looked down, blinking hard. He wasn't a man used to crying, but the tears came anyway, not loud, not desperate, but quiet and steady, like rain against a window. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling shakily. I used to think strength was about control, but the truth is, it's about courage. The courage to be open, the courage to care. I didn't know that until you left. He laughed softly, a fragile sound, almost breaking. I told myself I wanted to change the world, but all I really needed was to change the way I saw it, the way I saw myself. Claire's voice was gentle when she finally spoke. Ethan, I don't need you to apologize for who you were. We all build walls when we're scared, but I do need to know, are you done hiding behind them? He met her gaze, eyes raw but honest. I want to be. I don't know if I'll ever get it perfect, but I'm done pretending that I don't feel, that I don't care. She nodded slowly, taking in every word. Her expression was kind, but not indulgent. She wasn't there to comfort him. She was there to witness him. I believe you, she said quietly, but belief isn't the same as trust. Trust needs proof. I know, he said, and I don't expect you to give it right away. Claire looked back toward the ocean, her arms folded loosely, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't want the man who hides, she said. I want the man who shows up. The simplicity of the statement struck him harder than any accusation could have. He closed his eyes, the words sinking deep. I'm here, he whispered, not perfectly, not fully, but I'm here. The wind carried his voice out to sea, and for a long time, they stood in silence, two people who had finally stopped running from themselves. The sun sank lower, the horizon burning in soft oranges and pinks. Claire's hair caught the light, glowing like copper. Ethan studied her face, not as a man admiring beauty, but as someone finally understanding the weight of another person's truth. Do you ever think, he asked quietly, that maybe we meet people not to change them, but to see ourselves through them? Claire smiled faintly. Maybe. Or maybe we meet them to remember who we were before the world told us who to be. He nodded, the words resting gently between them. The tide crept closer, lapping at their shoes. Ethan reached down, slipped off his shoes, and stepped into the surf. The water was cold, almost shocking, but it felt clean. He turned back to her, a small, boyish grin breaking through the heaviness. "You ever notice how the ocean never apologizes for its waves?" She laughed softly. "It just keeps showing up." He smiled. Exactly. For the first time, the air around them felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed, but because something real had finally been spoken aloud. They stood there not lovers, not strangers, just two people who had finally met each other in the middle of their truth. As the sun slipped below the horizon, Claire stepped forward, her voice almost lost in the wind. "Keep showing up, Ethan, for yourself, for what matters." He nodded, his eyes steady. "I will." And in the hush of that moment, surrounded by the endless rhythm of the sea, it was clear forgiveness wasn't a destination, it was a beginning. The sun lingered low over the Oregon coast, painting the sky in muted golds and rose-colored light. After Ethan's confession, silence wrapped around them again, not heavy like before, but soft, like a blanket worn thin by use. Claire stood beside him, the tide brushing her ankles. The waves moved in slow rhythm, carrying the sound of forgiveness, not spoken, not yet earned, but somehow present. Ethan didn't reach for her. He didn't need to. Some moments aren't built for words or gestures. They're built for breath, for stillness, for being. They started walking. The shoreline stretched endlessly ahead, wet sand glimmering beneath the afternoon sun. Each step left an imprint that the next wave quietly erased, one after another, as if the ocean itself was helping them let go. For a while, they didn't talk at all. Only the sound of the sea and the faint cries of gulls filled the air. Then Claire spoke, her voice light but thoughtful. "Do you ever think about what you'd do differently, if you could start over?" Ethan smiled faintly, eyes still on the horizon. "Every day." And she asked. He took a deep breath. "I used to think I'd change everything, all the choices that made me hard, all the walls I built. But now, I think I just changed the way I carried them." She looked at him curiously. "What do you mean I can't undo the past?" he said softly. "But I can stop letting it own me?" The wind caught his words, carrying them across the sand. They walked further, their footprints trailing behind them like a map of two lives finally moving in the same direction. Claire began to talk, not about him, not about them, but about herself, about the years she spent trying to fit into a world that demanded she shrink, about the times she felt invisible in rooms full of men who called her capable but never listened long enough to see it. She laughed once, shaking her head. "Funny thing is, I thought if I worked hard enough, they'd see my worth. But now I know it was never my job to convince them." Ethan nodded slowly, his expression solemn. "You shouldn't have had to." Her eyes softened. "Maybe not, but you're learning. That matters." He smiled gently. "I'm trying. That's all any of us can do," she said. As the sun climbed higher, they stopped near a cluster of driftwood. Ethan sat down, elbows resting on his knees, staring at the horizon. "You know," he said after a while, "when I was younger, I thought peace was something you earned like success. If you followed all the right rules, worked hard enough, maybe one day you'd deserve it." He glanced up at her, the corner of his mouth curving in a rueful smile. "But peace doesn't come from order. It comes from surrender." Claire tilted her head, her tone soft but curious. "And what are you surrendering now?" He looked down at his hands, tracing the lines across his palms as if reading an old story. "My mother's voice, my fear of softness, the belief that love has to be perfect to be safe." He exhaled slowly. "And maybe, my guilt." Claire's gaze lingered on him, not judging, not pitying. She just listened. That was her gift, he realized. She didn't fix things. She simply made space for them to heal. By late afternoon, the wind had calmed. The waves grew gentler, the light warmer. They walked again, their pace slower now, unhurried. The sand between their toes, the cool touch of the water, it all felt grounding, simple, real, Every so often, their shoulders brushed, just barely. Neither pulled away. Claire spoke again, her voice thoughtful. I used to think forgiveness was about letting someone back in. He turned toward her, listening. But now, she continued, I think it's about letting yourself move forward with or without them. Ethan nodded, understanding deeper than words could express. I'm not asking you to let me back in, he said quietly, just to walk beside me for a while. She smiled, eyes softening. I think that's what we're doing. They walked until the sun began to dip low again, casting long shadows that stretched across the wet sand. The ocean glowed like molten glass. Every step they took shimmered briefly before the tide reached up to erase it. It felt symbolic, the sea washing away what no longer needed to remain. The old rules, the old voices, the old versions of themselves. At one point, Ethan stopped and looked down at their fading footprints. Do you think everything gets washed away eventually? He asked. Claire looked out at the waves, her hair catching the gold light. Not everything, she said softly. Just the things we're ready to release. He smiled, eyes glinting with a quiet kind of peace. Then maybe I'm ready? As evening settled, they found themselves standing near the same driftwood bench from earlier. The wind had turned cool again, carrying the scent of sea salt and pine. Neither spoke. They didn't need to. There was nothing left to explain, nothing left to fix. Ethan looked at Claire, the setting sun reflecting in his eyes. No walls, no armor, just presence, slowly, hesitantly. He reached out his hand. She hesitated for only a moment before placing hers in his. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a declaration. It was quiet, the kind of gesture that says more than 1,000 words ever could. They stood there, hand in hand. The world hushed around them. The waves rolled in, touching the shore, pulling away, returning again, the eternal rhythm of letting go and beginning anew. And for the first time in a long, long while, Ethan Ward didn't think about control or image or the past. He simply breathed the salt air filling his lungs, the warmth of her hand grounding him in the present. Peace had finally found him, not through perfection, but through presence. 2 months passed since that quiet evening by the Oregon shore. The sea still whispered in Ethan's memory, not as a wound, but as a reminder of how peace sounds when it finally finds you. He had returned to Seattle with something new in his stride, not confidence exactly, but clarity. For years, he had built walls of order, control, and ambition. Now, he was learning the beauty of what could grow when you opened a window instead. It began with a headline that morning in the Seattle Times: Ethan Ward appoints first female vice president of Ward Enterprises. The article spread quickly, across business pages and social media, accompanied by a photo of Claire Monroe standing beside Ethan, composed and radiant. The ocean blue scarf she wore fluttering slightly in the spring wind, but behind that headline wasn't a grand announcement or a marketing strategy. It was a quiet decision, born from something deeper than change, redemption. Claire hadn't accepted right away. She made it clear that her return came with one condition: the culture itself had to change, not just in title, but in spirit. And Ethan agreed. In the weeks that followed, Ward Enterprises began to look and feel different. The sterile silence of the halls gave way to laughter again. Conference rooms, once lit by cold, fluorescent lights, now opened to warm tones and open conversations. Ethan launched mentorship programs for young women entering corporate leadership, not as a gesture of guilt, but as an act of growth. He encouraged flexible schedules, creative collaboration, and space for balance. For the first time, people weren't afraid to be human in his company, and neither was he. Some evenings, when the office lights dimmed and the city hummed below, Ethan would stand by the window of his top-floor suite and remember what the view used to mean: power, isolation, control. Now, it meant possibility. Claire often joined him in those late hours, sometimes to discuss projects, sometimes just to share silence. They worked together as equals two minds, two hearts, both weathered by experience, both learning how to lead without losing themselves. Their relationship wasn't the kind that filled tabloids or whispered through office corridors. It was quiet, steady, grounded a partnership built not on intensity, but understanding. There were no grand gestures, no public displays, just two people who had walked through fire and learned how to keep each other warm without burning. One Friday evening, as the sun began to set over the skyline, Ethan and Claire stepped out onto the rooftop terrace, a place few people knew he used to visit alone. The sky stretched wide, awash in amber and lavender hues, the kind of beauty that asks for silence rather than applause. He poured 2 glasses of wine, the bottle resting between them on the small iron table. Claire leaned on the railing, watching the city lights flicker on one by one. "Seattle looks different from up here," she said. "It is," he replied softly. "Or maybe we are." She smiled at that, a quiet, knowing smile. Maybe both. They stood there in easy stillness, sipping their wine, watching the world beneath them move cars like ribbons of light. People like brief stories crossing paths. For years, Ethan had seen this view as proof of his success, the empire he had built from nothing. Now, he saw something else. A reminder that no matter how high you climb, the point isn't the height. It's whether you can still feel the ground beneath your feet. He glanced over at Claire. Her hair caught the fading light, a halo of gold and soft shadow. There was peace in her presence, not the kind that demanded attention, but the kind that restored it. "You changed this place," he said quietly. She looked at him, brow arched. "We changed it." He shook his head, smiling. "No, I built the walls. You taught me to open the doors." Claire laughed softly, the sound warm and unguarded. "I think you just needed someone to remind you that walls aren't homes." He nodded, eyes reflecting the sunset. "You were right about what that control isn't strength. It's fear disguised as order. Real strength is staying open when it's easier to close off." She studied him for a moment, her expression softening. "You learned that well." He raised his glass slightly, as if in a quiet toast. To the teacher, then. She clinked her glass against his, smiling. To the student who finally listened. They both laughed not the way lovers laugh, but the way 2 old souls do when they finally understand the same truth. As the sky deepened into twilight, Ethan leaned back against the railing, taking in the city below. "I used to think happiness came from building something perfect," he said, "but I think it comes from learning to love what's imperfect in business, in people, in ourselves." Claire nodded. "That's where the real work begins. And the real peace," he added. They stood in silence again, the cool evening breeze brushing past them. Somewhere below, a street musician played a soft tune on a saxophone, a sound both melancholic and beautiful, the kind that settles into your chest and stays there. Ethan turned toward her, his tone gentle. "Thank you, Claire." "For what?" "For not giving up on the possibility of me even when I did." Her eyes met his, steady and kind. "You found your way. That was always your choice." As night settled fully, they remained on the rooftop, side by side, the city glowing beneath them like a living heartbeat. No promises were made that evening, no declarations, no confessions, just presence the kind that doesn't demand to be understood, only felt. And in that quiet moment, Ethan Ward finally understood what love could be. Not the wild rush of passion or the fragile hope of redemption, but the steady rhythm of peace shared between 2 people who had both learned how to stay. The new chapter of his life didn't begin with applause or headlines. It began right there, between 2 glasses of wine, a soft sunset, and the kind of silence that finally felt whole. A full year passed after that evening on the rooftop, 12 months that came and went, like pages gently turning in a book neither of them wanted to close. The world had changed, as it always does. But what mattered most didn't. Ward Enterprises continued to thrive not through expansion or record-breaking profits, but through a quiet revolution of heart. People smiled more. Meetings ended with laughter. The walls that once echoed with silence now carried the warmth of humanity. And at the center of it all, Ethan and Claire stood side by side, not in the shadow of headlines, but in the sunlight of something far rarer peace. Their love had never been about grand gestures or public declarations. It was steady, lived in, honest, built not from the rush of passion, but from the grace of endurance. Two people who had learned, after everything, that love isn't a rescue. It's a choice you keep making every single day. That spring, Ethan found himself driving south again. The same winding road, the same scent of salt and pine in the air, the same Oregon coastline that had once broken him open and then stitched him back together. The house still stood at the edge of the cliff, weathered but strong. He'd spent the past year restoring it, one board, one window, one memory at a time. It wasn't grand. It wasn't meant to be. It was simply theirs. Inside, the rooms were filled with simple things, books, light, the faint smell of coffee and cedar. And when Claire arrived that weekend carrying her laughter like the ocean breeze, it felt less like a visit and more like a homecoming. They spent the afternoon walking along the shore, as they always did, no crowds, no distractions, just two people whose footsteps fell into rhythm with the tide. Ethan had planned no surprise, no elaborate speech, only truth. He'd spent too many years performing. Now, all he wanted was to be seen. As the sun dipped low, casting streaks of gold across the water, he led her to the old driftwood bench, the one he'd built with his father long ago. It had been repaired recently, sanded smooth, strong again. He turned to her, hands slightly trembling not from fear, but from the magnitude of peace. "Do you remember what you told me here?" he asked softly. Claire smiled, brushing her hair from her face. "Which part? That you didn't want the man who hides?" He said. "You wanted the man who shows up." She nodded slowly. "And you did." Ethan took a deep breath, his voice low, certain. "I showed up, Claire. For this company, for my life, for you, but mostly for myself." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box, simple, unpolished, handmade. Inside it, a single ring gold, understated, glowing softly in the fading light. He looked up at her, eyes steady but full. "I don't have fancy words this time," he said. "No promises I can't keep. Just this: I've spent my whole life trying to control everything around me and losing what mattered most in the process." He paused, his voice breaking slightly. "Now I finally understand. Forever isn't about control. It's about courage. The courage to let love in, and to keep it." The waves hushed. The wind fell quiet. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Claire's eyes glistened as she looked at him, not with surprise, but with a calm certainty that said she had always known this moment would come. She knelt beside him in the sand, her hand resting gently on his. "Ethan," she whispered, "you don't owe me words. You already gave me the truth." He smiled through the warmth gathering behind his eyes. "Still, I'd like to ask—" She tilted her head, her smile soft and knowing. "Then ask." He swallowed hard, then said simply, "Will you marry me for a moment?" The world felt completely still, the kind of stillness that happens only when time decides to listen. Claire's answer wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud or tearful or cinematic. It was soft. It was certain. "Yes," she said. Then, after a pause, she added with a quiet smile, "But not because you changed for me, because you changed for yourself." The simplicity of her words cut deeper than any vow. He nodded slowly, his throat tight with emotion. "I guess that's the only way it ever lasts," he whispered. She squeezed his hand. "Exactly." They stayed there a long time, the waves reaching up to kiss their feet, the wind tugging gently at their hair. No cameras, no press, no applause, just peace. Later, as dusk melted into night, they walked barefoot along the shoreline, laughter mingling with the sound of the sea. Their shadows stretched long and thin across the sand. two outlines moving as one, each step washed away by the tide, but each moment permanent in its simplicity. The moon rose, soft and round above the horizon, casting silver over the water. Ethan looked at her, then really looked, and realized something he'd never put into words. He hadn't found love. He had learned it, and learning it had changed everything. The waves rolled in again, whispering against the sand. She leaned her head on his shoulder. He smiled, his arm gently circling her waist. There was no plan beyond this moment, no finish line, no final rule, just the rhythm of the ocean, the warmth of her hand, the soft hum of a life no longer lived in fear. And as they disappeared down the beach, two quiet souls walking into the wind, a single truth echoed through the salt air. Forever wasn't about control. It was about courage, the courage to let love in. In the end, Ethan Ward's story wasn't just about love. It was about awakening. It reminds us that control can build walls, but compassion builds bridges. That strength isn't found in keeping the world at arm's length, but in daring to open our hearts even when it feels unsafe. So many of us spend years trying to perfect ourselves, to appear strong, composed, untouched by emotion. But real strength comes the moment we allow softness back in. The moment we understand that kindness does not weaken us, it frees us. Ethan learned that success without connection is just another kind of loneliness. That love, in its truest form, is not about changing for someone else, but about becoming the version of ourselves that finally feels true. And maybe that's the quiet miracle of life. We spend half of it building walls, and the other half learning to open doors. Because at any age, it's never too late to let love in, to begin again, and to redefine what forever really means. Thank you for spending your time with Shining Stories. If this story touched your heart, even for a moment, please take a second to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Every story we tell is a reminder that it's never too late to change, to heal, and to love again. Your support helps these stories reach more hearts that might need them tonight. Until next time, stay kind, stay curious, and keep your heart open to the light.